Welcome, everybody. My name's David Scobie. I'm the Executive Dean of the New School for Public Engagement, the division of the university that is the home for the Center for New York City Affairs, the Urban Policy Program, and the Milano School for International Affairs Management and Urban Policy. And it's a great joy for me to welcome you to tonight's program on 40 years of change and continuity in New York City, which is a celebration of 40 years of our urban policy and urban management program. As I was thinking about tonight's event and welcoming you, I was a set of kind of memes about New York that captured some of the narrative of the last 40 years flashed through my head. In 1972, if you were to do a Rorschach test on the phrase New York, you would probably have gotten back something like urban crisis. And then 5 years later, maybe bankruptcy. And 10 or 15 years after that, gentrification. And now maybe something like global city. And all of those words, I think, cover over a massive complexity and contradiction, even as they tell a story about kind of the arc of change in New York over the past 40 years. And I have no doubt that our panelists will at once illuminate that narrative and critique the simplicity of those kinds of terms at the same time. But it seems to me one really important thread of continuity, one small, brightly colored thread in that fabric of change has been this program that we now call the Milano School and also the the Center for New York City Affairs, which was the very first home of our urban policy and urban professions master's program. The urban policy program, the center, and what we now call Milano, were, I think, pioneers in a movement in higher education to weave together learning and research with engaged work for the public good, for public work. They have always done what I like to call learning in action, learning through public action and learning as a medium of action. And in that, they anticipate a very large movement in higher education that's gained steam over the last 40 years. They were pioneers and forerunners of it. And now this program is exemplary of the mission of the New School and our division, the New School for Public Engagement, precisely for bringing to bear the rigorous study and teaching and learning and understanding of public life in the city, training our students to intervene and play a role in that life at the same time. So I'm very proud of that 40-year history of the center, of the program, and our relationship to New York City. And I'm confident that it's right in the thick of engaged learning and public work for the next 40 years. This is a wonderful way to celebrate moving forward by looking backward at New York over that same period. So welcome. I want to introduce my colleague Alex Schwartz, who will act as MC of the evening.
Thank you, David. I'm going to be quite brief so we can have as much time as possible with a terrific panel. Again, I'm Alex Schwartz. I've been in the urban policy program for about half of its history, about 20 years almost, and I was chair of the program for just over 10 years. And when we realized it was the 40th anniversary, thought it was an excellent opportunity to reflect on how the city has changed over time, how it hasn't changed so much, just as the program has evolved over its 40 years. And I'll say a couple words about the program. We've trained hundreds now of people in government, in the nonprofit sector in New York City and in other cities in the United States and around the world to address a wide range of urban issues. And I guess how many alumni are in the room? Is curious. Oh, wow, that's terrific. I'm so glad to see so many. And the program continues. As David said, we're very much committed to civic engagement, to learning by doing. We have a very strong lab course, which I'm now directing, where we have teams of students working for clients in government and the nonprofit sector, which still actually recruiting clients for next semester, so let me know if you have any ideas. We continue to do many of the same things as we've done 40 years ago. I guess the main difference is we probably address a wider range of topics, and we focus not just on New York City, but other cities, and increasingly now we're trying to adopt comparative international perspectives, looking at how issues in New York are different from or similar to issues in other cities around the world. So without further ado, let me introduce Andrew White, and we'll bring up the panel. So thank you very much.
Good evening, and thanks for coming. So, yeah, the panel can stay there for a few minutes. I'm going to set this up. I direct the Center for New York City Affairs, which is actually the precursor to the graduate school. I think the center was created in the mid-'60s. The graduate school emerged out of it with the degree programs in 1972. The center now does applied policy research on family and child services, child welfare, public education, poverty in New York, among other things. So how many of you lived here in the 1970s? Great. How many in the 80s and 90s? All right. So I was just a little kid in 1972. Despite how I look, and I have to admit that back then I was actually, I thought New York was the bane of existence. I lived in Boston. It was, but in 1972, when this program was created, New York had just come out of a severe recession. It was headed into another one in '73. 7.9 million people lived in the 5 boroughs, almost exactly the same number that lived here in 1950. But those people, who those people were between 1950 and 1970, had changed radically. In the years after World War II, as many as 2 million white people left the city, moved to the suburbs, followed the new highways, took their mortgage deductions, got low-cost housing in the suburbs. And their apartments were largely rented to African American migrants from the South, Puerto Rican migrants from the island, and neighborhoods became very low-income neighborhoods over the course of 15, 20 years. They moved to a city that was beginning to lose its industrial base, and the city was losing good working-class jobs that made it possible for blue-collar people to survive and live well in the city. But in retrospect, the defining political feature of the late 60s and 70s, what really sets up this discussion today, was the fast-growing debt of the state and city government. And following the 1973 recession, right about the time that Governor Rockefeller decided to move to DC and become vice president, the debt came due and the banks stopped lending. They wouldn't underwrite any more bond sales. And at that point, the poverty rate in New York City was about 15%. As that all happened, New York City lost 500,000 jobs. Some were in the public sector, some in industry, some in services. And within that decade of the 1970s, the population of the city dropped by nearly 1 million people. So years ago, as a reporter, I used to go to a lot of political speeches, and I would go hear Senator Moynihan, Daniel Patrick Moynihan, and inevitably he'd return to this trope of the glory days of New York in the 1950s. And in some ways, he had a point. New York's economy was strong in the 1950s. When I would see him speak, this was the early 90s, late 80s, and the economy was not as strong. The city was affordable for working class people in the 1950s, and poverty was relatively low, and the housing stock was pretty good. But 1950s New York was a city where the fast-growing black and Puerto Rican population really didn't have much of a voice or much power. And this was a nation where immigration from beyond the borders was severely restricted at that time. Today, there's this different lament. There's this lament for the 1970s that I keep hearing. People look back with nostalgia at the sort of edgy city that we once had that many of you probably remember. You know, young people and working people could afford to live in this neighborhood, which is hard to believe. In terms of public policy, that 1970s fiscal crisis prompted a remarkable effort of this coming together. I mean, it's kind of taken on mythical, sort of created a mythical memory, but it was true. The financiers, union leaders, government officials came together to pull the city out of near bankruptcy. And they put meaningful restrictions on city budgets. They put new rules for borrowing. There was no more debt to be borrowed for operations once the budget was repaired over the course of the next few years. And in fact, the city budget was brought into balance much more quickly than people expected. But the 1970s also marked this moment when very big things started to go seriously wrong. The seeds of the crack epidemic were planted with the rising popularity of cocaine in New York in the 70s. When the innovators in the cocaine markets found rising poverty, the conflagration started just a few years later. The poverty rate in New York City reached 23% in the 1980s and stayed close to that for years to come. Child abuse and neglect reports flooded the system in the late 1980s, and 50,000 children landed in foster care. As Lilliam was just saying, there was only 16,000 in 1984, but by the end of the decade, it was 50,000 kids in foster care. The Koch-era construction boom in Midtown had led to the shuttering of single-room occupancy buildings all over Manhattan, central Manhattan, which, surprise, the homeless crisis suddenly emerged and became visible. Those buildings had housed thousands of single men and women, and suddenly they didn't have a place to live in Manhattan anyway, and many ended up on the streets. And at that time in the 80s also, the city converted these huge, once fancy hotels in Herald Square and Midtown and in Brooklyn, all built in a distant, glorious era. Those hotels were all converted into welfare hotels for families who were homeless. And of course, AIDS took a horrific toll through all of this. So by the time Ed Koch left office on the first day of the 1990s, the city had traveled from fiscal crisis through a real estate boom into another recession in 1987, and then headlong into this unbelievable social crisis that got worse each year. So in fact, from a poor person's perspective, things looked very bleak in New York in the late 80s and early 90s. At that time, the city owned roughly 100,000 units of housing in Harlem, central Brooklyn, the Bronx, and Lower East Side, and other neighborhoods. The city government owned this housing because landlords didn't want it anymore. But a lot of it was occupied. We had slums in New York. Those were the slums of New York. More than 1 million people were on public assistance in 1990. So I'm going through this whole litany. In fact, as I was writing down these notes, I was thinking, man, I sound like Mitt Romney the other night, rattling off everything that's wrong in the world and trying to find someone to blame. I thought he sounded kind of paranoid, but I put all this out, this grim history out there for another purpose, which is this remarkable truth that so much has changed in New York in the 20 years since then, since 1989, 90, 91. And in many ways, a lot has improved. There's still many very serious issues to take on, and we'll talk about this tonight. There's obviously not enough jobs for young people. There's severe overcrowding, particularly in immigrant communities, housing. Very high rates of poverty among children, particularly in single-parent households. And yet, over the last 4 decades, you can see many instances where an activist approach to government made a real clear difference. You have joint investments with the private sector in community building and developing the infrastructure of neighborhoods, and especially the housing of neighborhoods, that made a very clear difference. Immigration-related policy, even at the city level, made a difference. All of this and more helped transform the standard of living in New York to an extraordinary degree. So today there are large parts of town that many of us don't even recognize if you don't go there for a few years. Suddenly, it's kind of stunning. They go through such rapid change, and that's not always a great thing, but at the same time, I don't think there's any doubt that the standard of living, all the data show that the standard of living, even for people living in poverty in the South Bronx, is better than it was 20 years ago. So this evening, we're going to dive into a discussion about what happened in New York over the last 40 years, which is during the life of this program, the Urban Policy and Management Program of the New School. And we'll have time for questions and discussion from the audience, which I'm looking forward to that part. But first, let's bring up the panelists and get going. Fred, Mark, Lilliam. So this is a fantastic panel. Many of us have known for years, so this should be fun. I'll start from this end. Liz Kruger is a member of the state Senate. Been there now a decade. Hard to believe.
And I've aged even more.
Nah. She's currently the ranking minority member on the State Finance Committee. Through the 90s, she was the associate director of the Community Food Resource Center, doing a very different kind of work, but with, I think, many of the same objectives. Mark Yar is president of the New York City Housing Development Corporation. Prior to that, he worked at Citibank, running their community development program in the New York area, and was also local director of the Local Initiative Support Corporation. Roberto Ramirez is a partner of the Miram Group, a consulting firm that does lobbying and public affairs, and he was New York State Assemblyman for sort of Central South Bronx, I guess the Fordham neighborhood and surrounding, correct? From 1990 to 2000, and he was county leader of the Bronx Democratic Party from 1996 to 2000. Next to him is Lilliam Barrios-Paoli, who is commissioner of the Department for the Aging, and has been in the nonprofit sector at Safe Space and other organizations, was at one point president of Lincoln Hospital, and has held 4 commissioners' positions in city government, 5 commissioners' positions in city government, there you go, plus several other positions going back to, well, the late 70s. And Fred Siegel is the author of The Prince of the City, Giuliani, New York, and the Genius of American Life. He was professor at Cooper Union from '83 to 2009, and is now at St. Francis College in Brooklyn and at the Manhattan Institute. And John Mollenkopf is professor of sociology and political science at the CUNY Graduate Center and is director of the Center for Urban Research. So you can read more details on the paper you got outside. So John, I want to start with you. And I know you don't want to get too deep in the numbers to start things off. We'll have people snoozing, but if they aren't already. So what is it that makes New York so different today from 40 or even 20 years ago in terms of who lives here?
Well, Andrew, I think you did a really great job of framing our discussion and pointing out some of the key trends in the late 60s and 70s and into the 80s. And I would begin by contrasting the decade of the 70s, which I think all of us would admit, both on paper and in personal experience, was in many ways the worst decade of the city's history ever. You noted that the total population of the city went down by 1 million, since the minority population of the city increased substantially in that period in absolute and relative terms. The white population went down even more than 1 million. I think something like 1.7 million net loss in the white population in that decade alone. And that more or less equals all the suburbanization that you had talked about between the immediate post-war period and that, you know, through the 1950s. And if you look at New York in comparative perspective, in that period you would think, well, this city is headed on the same trajectory as Detroit, Cleveland, Milwaukee, St. Louis. It's gone over a kind of cliff set up by the interaction between deindustrialization and disinvestment on the one hand, and racial change that creates all kinds of conflicts and antagonisms and power struggles on the other. And yet, New York City is the only city that suffered anywhere near such a large population loss in that decade, that then turned around and began to gain population and has continued to gain population every decade to the point where we're roughly 8.3 million people now, as many, in fact, more than New York has ever had, whereas Detroit and Cleveland and so on are continued on their downward path in many dimensions. So it's a really interesting question. What was it about New York that made that kind of resilience possible? And I think you've pointed to some answers, but three of them in particular occur to me. The first that's obvious to all of us is immigration. And even in 1970, the foreign-born population of the city was quite low. It was at a historic low point. I don't remember what the exact number is, but it was a fraction of what it is today. And today, 37% of the people are foreign-born in the city, and if you count the children of immigrants, way over a majority of resident New Yorkers are either immigrants or the children of immigrants. And so and immigration was strongly associated with the population rebound of the city, and much of the neighborhood revitalization that you talked about, and the change that happens when you don't look at a place for a few years is not just gentrification, which we hear a lot more about, but immigrant revitalization of neighborhoods that were formerly Italian, Jewish, and so on. And if you go out to the most Italian parts of southern Brooklyn today, you can see that the storefronts that, when I moved to New York in 1980 were all Italian, and I made the mistake of going into a coffee house, a cappuccino place out there one day, and all the conversations stopped and they looked at me, "Who are you?" I was clearly in the wrong place. Well, those storefront signs are mostly in Chinese at this point. So there's that going on. But immigrants and the flows of migration are not just rabbits pulled out of the hat. I think the mayor has recommended to Detroit that migration might help them solve their problems there. Migrants are very sensitive to economic opportunity. And as you pointed out, the blue-collar aspects of New York City, the New York City economy, were rapidly on the decrease from the peak of maybe 1952 or 3 or 4, somewhere in there, to almost complete deindustrialization. We still have a lot of blue-collar activities, but they take place in the services rather than in goods-producing activities. So where did the economic growth come from that attracted immigrants and made it possible to have the sort of reverberation down the income scale that we have in our labor market? And people would obviously point to finance and the financialization of the American and global economy and the prominent role that New York plays in global financial services, which it does, and that's clearly part of the answer. But New York also has an incredibly rich tradition in what you would call nonprofit social services, whether it's universities, K-12 education, cultural institutions, even the public school system and the private school system. So that there's a huge kind of social services base that has been stable and I think fairly counter-cyclical, or at least not as cyclical as many of the other industries. The growth of the hospital sector, just to give a case in point, has been an avenue for major upward mobility for immigrant populations in New York City. And the public sector has also played an important role. And that leads me to the third stool of the leg on the three-legged stool. And I think competent government and activist government was a key part of the whole resilience story in a way that, I think doesn't jibe with conservative critiques of what was wrong with New York City government in the 1960s in the Lindsay era. And just to tick off a few things that government has has done well. I would say that the recapitalization of the transit system in the mid-1980s under Dick Ravitch's leadership was crucial. I mean, when I first, I'm a latecomer compared to some of you. I moved to New York City in the summer of 1980, and I actually looked for a job and a place to live during the spring 1980 transit strike, for those of you who might remember that. So I burned some holes in my shoes walking up and down the streets looking for a place to live and a job to do. Also, I think that the mayor's 10-year housing program and allied community development efforts were very important.
Which we'll get to in a minute.
You mentioned the 100,000 abandoned units in the city being the worst landlord. That also created an asset that has only recently, in the last few years, been exhausted for rebuilding neighborhoods. And this is, I'm somewhat ambivalent about this because in a sense we built new homogeneously low-income neighborhoods in certain parts of the city, but they seem not to have had the problems that public housing in the south side of Chicago had, for example.
So, yeah, I mean, in terms of, so we'll get to the housing discussion in a minute, because
Well, I'm
that's
just saying,
clearly, but that, yeah, no, but
instead of stepping back and saying we can't deal with problems, I think government stepped up and addressed, and Giuliani era reducing the reported crime rate and so forth. The government has made a real dent on a lot of things that in other jurisdictions people felt that government really wasn't capable of addressing. So I would say those three things account for our resilience.
So the city's economy is estimated now by McKinsey to be about 1.1 trillion. I saw another estimate that was 1.3 trillion, the New York City economy. It's about 7% of the entire nation's economic life is accounted for in New York City. So New York, as you said, real estate, finance, as well as services. But what has government, before we get into the housing and crime and those specific policy decisions, what has government done to make that happen in terms of economic growth, a strong economy to support what is clearly also the largest city budget of any city, perhaps in the world, I think. Fred, do you want to take a stab at that?
Koch was successful in part because of inflation. The inflation of the Koch, of the late Carter years, took the city off the hook for much of its debt. What was bad for the country was good for New York in terms of reducing the amount of enormous debt that we had built up. But the financialization that occurred, the finance goes from 7% of GDP in 1982 to 21%, and unsustainable in 2008. What's bad for the country was good for New York, the enormous growth of financial sector. And we got carried along on that wave. The problem we've always had is that in boom times, we spend everything we have and then some. And so when we come to downturns, as perhaps we're coming to one now, as QE3 ends, we've been very lucky in recent years. Ben Bernanke has been our guardian angel. He's kept the stock market going, even as the economy, he's kept Wall Street going, even as Main Street has suffered. But we're going to face serious problems. The '75 fiscal crisis didn't exactly allow us to balance the books. What it did was it produced new ways of pushing costs off into the future. So the enormous cost of pensions, which are growing rapidly as a total percentage of the budget, pension and debt, that bill is coming due. And I suspect that the Mayor Bloomberg's tenure will not look so rosy viewed in that light. But the most important thing, in my opinion, the government did was reduce crime. Speaking as someone who grew up here and came back here after college and has lived here continuously for the last 40 years, the transformation of neighborhoods occurred in part because people felt safe again. People forget that in 1968, the year before John Lindsay was reelected, New York was still the largest city in the country in terms of manufacturing jobs. Still. What happens between 69 and 77 is not just an explosion of crime, not just the creation of an underclass, but rapid deindustrialization. We go off a cliff. No one could have managed this very well. And God knows, Beam couldn't have managed it probably in the best of circumstances. And the same could be true of his doppelganger, who was taller and better looking, John Lindsay. They had the same policies, the same incompetence in different bodies. But the net effect of that was we went through this terrible, terrible period. But at the end of that was first inflation and then financialization under Reagan. What crime does, it makes neighborhoods valuable again. It makes good real estate, nice housing. Bedford-Stuyvesant doesn't have bad housing. The neighborhood I live in now, first I lived in the People's Republic of Park Slope. And then I moved a block away from Mark to Ditmas Park. And in 1992, 93, when crime was really out of control, and there were civilian patrols, there was a sense of time to evacuate. There's an extraordinary poll that came out a few days ago. 65% of New Yorkers want to be here in 5 years. That same poll taken in 1990, I can't remember if it's 1 or 2 now, had 55 to 60% of the people wanting to leave within 5 years. People planning their exits. The city came close to the cliff for a second time. And it's, by the way, it's not that crime has gone away. It's not that drug dealing has gone away. A few blocks from where I live, on Argyle Road in Ditmas Park, 2 blocks away is the corner of Argyle and Church. That was, in the late 1980s, early 1990s, an open-air drug market, 24 hours a day. People were afraid of it. You drove around it. You didn't go anywhere near it. It's not that that drug dealing didn't go away, but it went indoors. It no longer dominated the public space. And over time, as it ceased to dominate the public space, you had improvements. And so now, much to people's amazement, now I have to give my wife a bit of credit. Much to people's surprise, Church Avenue now has nice stores. Not all of Church Avenue, but that stretch of Church Avenue has some nice new places. People want to go there again. And what happened there in miniature is what's happened to much of the city.
What about on the front of big business? I mean, you talked about financialization. Mark, maybe you have a take on this, but to what degree did the development deals and tax incentives that were offered by mayor after mayor, I mean, Ed Koch was master of the incentives for the development of the central business district. To what degree did those kinds of things, or retention strategies to keep big business here, did those make a difference in the growth of New York City's economy?
I'm going to profess humility here. I know that panelists should never be humble, but this isn't really my realm. I wouldn't. There have been critiques of the incentive programs. Most of my life has been spent in community development and housing finance, and I know what I believe is a strong and powerful narrative that exists there that in some senses dovetails with Fred's. But I'd leave it to other panelists who are much more familiar with the realm of economic incentives than I am to talk about it. I would add, though, one thing, that it's not uncommon and it's unfortunate that when people talk about economic development, they consistently fail to recognize the fact that if you want a big economic driver in your local economy and your city economy, housing is it. Right. It has been, is, always will be. The financial crisis, the collapse that has occurred and that we're in the midst of now, the Great Recession, started with housing, and it will end when the housing issues are solved. So if we bring that home and you look at New York City, and you think about the reemergence of the city's neighborhoods, one part of it was the development of strategies to fight crime. But they dovetailed very nicely with a city effort over 4 decades that in effect was James Q. Wilson's theory of broken windows writ large, right. That you couldn't possibly tamp down crime in neighborhoods, manage it, reduce it, if on every block there were vacant buildings, and there were block after block of vacant buildings, and the only people living in the vacant buildings were homeless folks or junkies. There's no way you could do something about crime when neighborhoods were so anarchic, and so difficult for the residents to live in. So pursuing simply an anti-crime strategy without pursuing a strategy in the communities of the city of New York to rebuild those neighborhoods, that would have been a strategy, the anti-crime strategy, that ultimately would have failed. What has allowed that, I think, to succeed has been the reconstruction of the city's neighborhoods, and in the process of that, not just rebuilding the housing, and over the last 40 years, the city has financed in one way or another about 350,000 units of housing, directly touched them. It hasn't just been that. It hasn't just been rebuilding those blocks, but it's been rebuilding the real estate market, rebuilding the market for goods and services, and rebuilding communities that people can feel comfortable living in. Could that have been done without a anti-crime strategy? No. But could the anti-crime strategy possibly have succeeded without this enormous investment that probably is something like over this past 40 years, $30 billion when you add up all the city's commitments and the private sector's commitments? Without that sort of investment of capital in the city's neighborhoods, the neighborhoods would be smoldering ruins today.
So looking back, Mark, let's stay with that.
Sure.
If you go back to the 80s, or even in the late 70s, Roger Starr was talking about planned shrinkage, about shutting down services in whole neighborhoods and essentially encouraging people to move out of parts of the South Bronx. What was the initial policy response to slum housing and the growth of poverty in New York, as opposed to what Koch finally did later in his administration?
Well, the 70s were, as I think Fred's pointed out, John's pointed out, a time of enormous economic difficulty for the city of New York. Its economy was being deconstructed. A new economy really hadn't emerged out of that. The city's tax base was substantially eroded. So all the efforts of the city really had to be, on a modest level, I think. The fact is, during that period of time, the city's commitment to housing actually, you had public housing, you had certain federal programs, but if you look back in the 70s or you came into the 80s, I think in 1985, the city's commitment out of its own capital budget was $25 million. By 2 years later under Koch, when Koch ramped up the plan, it went up to $850 million. The city's commitment to housing was greater than, I think Alex knows these numbers probably better than I do, greater than the aggregate commitment to housing of the next 50 largest cities in the United States. I think that was only possible because of the city making its way out of the fiscal crisis of the 70s. Only possible when it's firmed up its tax base and it was able to go back into the capital markets and start borrowing money, because one of the decisive decisions, really most important decisions on the part of the Koch administration, after lots of discussion with bond counsel, was that, we can issue general obligation bonds and we can take some of the proceeds of those GO bonds and we can devote them to housing. And there was a long, long discussion and legal discussion around that before that decision was made. But once it was made, it allowed the city to access literally over time billions of dollars for the purpose of housing. And that was something no other city, I think, or very few cities in the United States did.
And what led to the decision to make nonprofit organizations the core of that revitalization?
They were the last people standing in the neighborhoods. It's really simple. They weren't private. From the standpoint of the banks, this was not a very profitable business. So there were some key federal decisions made, the creation of the low-income housing tax credit being one of them. But it's not like from the, private developers looked at the South Bronx, looked at Melrose, or looked at Longwood, or looked at Bed-Stuy, or looked at East New York, Brownsville, and said, oh, what a paradise. I think I'll go there and put equity into housing development. That wasn't the case. So in many respects, the only people left who were prepared and capable of doing development and could figure out ways to accumulate capital were the nonprofits. and the residents of those communities. Now, you go out to the neighborhoods in terms of who we borrow to. If you look at who we're borrowing to at HDC, it's predominantly for-profits. Our biggest borrower is a nonprofit, really big borrower. But the fact is, in the course of this, resurgence of these neighborhoods and investment into neighborhoods, they have been more attractive now. You see a lot of for-profit developers who've built fabulous businesses doing development in communities that in the 1970s and 1980s, a developer would have never thought that they were going to do business in.
Yeah, so on the one hand, this was this massive investment that clearly paid off. And you could argue that it's actually helped preserve diversity in some neighborhoods, like the People's Republic of Park Slope.
Sure.
On the other hand, it's all, to what degree has it been a force for displacement, gentrification, by setting things up for the market to take over?
In fact, I think that's a really complicated discussion. And at one point when we were doing a lot of deals, back in the 90s, started doing a lot of deals in Harlem and all the low-income communities, but in particular Harlem. So nonprofits would bring deals into the community board. And the community board would say, we're tired of building all this housing for low-income people, for poor people, for homeless people. Build some housing for middle-class people. And, and the groups would make their way through the gauntlet, and we'd finance the deal that was, made sense economically for the neighborhood. 10 years later, groups go in with a deal. We're being forced out of the neighborhood. We're being displaced. There's nothing but gentrification going on. So there's been this kind of, oscillation between, call it two extremes. The fact is, over time, in building the market for housing in these communities, we've built a market that allows for middle-income families to live in those communities. They're nicer now. You go to portions of Harlem, they're mixed-income neighborhoods at this point, predominantly low-income, but have not insignificant numbers of middle-income people. And if you look at the neighborhood, let's say back in 1975 or 85 or 90. I remember one time taking the subway up to 153rd Street, up to Bradhurst, northern Manhattan. We were checking out the neighborhood to see development. We were going to do it. And it was just a wasteland. It was a wasteland, but we laughed. I was with a friend and we laughed because all we saw was development opportunities. This was a decade of development we were going to be able to undertake and did successfully undertake with this, with the city in that community. But so much, the issue of displacement, let's say in Harlem, you'd have to go back and really look at the numbers because remember, people headed for the exits. It wasn't like lots of white people left the city in the 70s and 80s, boom, headed out to the suburbs. But in a place like Harlem, lots of African-American residents and Latino residents in the South Bronx left the neighborhood as well. The biggest form of displacement was the abandonment that went on and the arson that drove people out of their homes. So if you look at net, what the population is today versus what it was in 1970 when so many people left, like in the community boards of South Bronx, 2/3 of the residents left. They had no choice but to leave. If you look at Board 3, Board 4, Board 3, for instance, I think it had maybe a population of 150,000 back in, let's say in the 60s or 70s. By the time the firestorm had swept across the South Bronx, there were 50,000 people there. Nobody was left. Right. So, so you look at it, and the same thing occurred in Harlem. So if you look and you say, well, what about the issue of displacement? Well, the biggest form of displacement occurred during the 70s and 80s. That's when people were forced out the door.
Although I'm going to play devil's advocate with Mark, and he's one of my favorite people in city government. So in the 90s, I was running eviction prevention programs in Harlem and Washington Heights and the South Bronx. And so displacement was huge numbers of poor people being dragged into housing court over and over again with landlords trying to get rid of them to push out because they saw the economic opportunities for gentrification and the deals that were being made. And so I agree with you, you're right. I mean, when they started asking about economic development before, I whispered over here, let me take that answer. Because in fact, I will say the only kind of economic development that I have studied that has actually worked for the city is housing. And Mark is 100% right, that when you look at the dollars and cents win of government investing in preservation and building of planned housing for its future, that is a win-win short-term and long-term. You create jobs, you get an incredible return for the government dollar, you get to do private-public partnerships, and it's also then the anchor for other good economic activity to happen literally block by block, neighborhood by neighborhood. You look at the other kinds of economic development models that government has tried over the last, I was going to say 30 years because I know it's a 40-year discussion, but I was in high school for a certain period of that time. So I'm proudly middle-aged, but apparently on the young side of middle-aged. But if you look at it for the 30 years that I've been around here in New York City and state, you have used up an incredible amount of tax revenue that could otherwise have been available for government to make the decisions about the best public policy uses of the money, to ensure that you have infrastructure and an educated workforce and public safety, which apparently are the things that work for economic development and have, I think as Fred was saying before, dramatically led to some of the successes and growth of New York City over the last 40 years. And you look at some of those individual deals, and I've looked about the state money that's been wasted, but I've also looked at the reports about the city money. I mean, who remembers, tests in this room, when there were only 3 TV stations, one of them said, I'm going to New Jersey unless you give me an unbelievable reduction in my taxes, and the city gave it to them. Then the second station pretended it was going to New Jersey. It wasn't really even looking, but it pretended and said, well, I need the same deal as the other one. And, you know, you all know there are 3 letters. I don't know which one was first anymore. I don't know whether CBS, NBC, or ABC. But the second one said, I need the same deal, not to pay taxes. And the city said, okay. And then the third one said, I'm not going to pretend I'm going anywhere, but I'll be damned if I'm paying my taxes if these 2 guys aren't. And the city, said, okay, I guess that's fair. So much of our model of economic development, city and state, has been a race to the bottom exercise in actually collecting tax revenue that it could then use as government to try to make the best decisions it can about what kind of additional money it ought to be putting into housing infrastructure, what it ought to be doing to ensure for quality of life for the senior citizens. We haven't gotten to Lilliam yet, her current job, because she has had every job in city government, I forgot. You know, what we don't have in the coffers of city and state money, because everybody has this other giant idea with economic development and loss of tax money. And I know as a state legislator, when we had that insane program called Empire Zones, which literally sort of morphed into, I can redesign it tomorrow to put you in it and throw you out if I want to, and put you in it and throw you out. And I actually at one time during one of the debates in the Senate said, let's just make the entire state an Empire Zone. Who's kidding who? If you just want to reduce business taxes and property taxes and whatever taxes, the small guys stand a better shot if we just across the board cut all of it. And I'm hardly an anti-tax legislator, as you well know.
And how did people respond to that?
People were, well, that's, I mean, they thought I was crazy. But if you actually looked up every proposal for a tax reduction for somebody in the state of New York and you add it all together, they actually all should support my idea. You know, just,
well,
and
the tax attorneys won't, but
no, I know
just
it's
about
true.
everybody else.
So I have to say that, you know, government's very good at many things, and it's critical that it be there whether it's good or not on other things. But I'm sort of a weird free market Fred Siegel type when it comes to using tax money. That was a compliment, Fred. Tax money sort of because we know better than what the private sector will do in the economy.
Right. Well, so on the housing side, before we leave it, I mean, is there any reason New York shouldn't have done that? Obviously, the debt is an issue. Fred, is that a concern, the debt that was taken on to develop housing?
Sorry to say, I have to agree with everything Liz just said. Liz and Mark just said. Housing has been far and away. You can argue. Let me back up. The Empire Zones were wonderful, but the way they worked is the way state government still works. The best connected people get the best tax breaks. And that's why people like myself are in favor of smaller government. The smaller the government is, the less opportunity there is to buy favoritism. That said, we got our best bang for the buck out of housing. I agree with that.
Okay. So Lilliam, the other big part of what we talked about in the housing movement was this similar across the board in social services and in delivery of services. It was the use of the nonprofit sector, starting especially strong in the Koch years. I mean, in the 1970s, it was a unionized city workforce that delivered nearly all social services in New York, far more than today. Today, nonprofits run daycare centers, senior centers, homeless shelters, case management programs, the entire foster care system, a growing part of the probation system, other parts of the criminal justice system. It's remarkable how it just keeps getting more and more central or more and more fundamental to the way we do services in New York.
So I have been in New York 41 years, and I started working at HRA at the very end of '79. And when I came to HRA had about 36,000 people working there, and all of the services were directly delivered by city workers. So the home care sector that exists now, there were home attendants that worked for HRA and housekeeping attendants and homemakers, because in the houses that were children, they had homemakers. The foster care system, there were, the old religious agencies, there were very few non-sectarian that had traditionally done foster care, but we didn't have contracts with them. The state had established a per diem, and the city just paid it. And there was no evaluation going on. I mean, it was very, we believed in the mantra of they're nice people doing good things, and we all believed it, and that was that. And so what I saw from the time that I joined government was an increased growth of the not-for-profit sector, given the services that were added, but also the relationship between not-for-profits and the government was increasingly codified. It was made contractual. There were rules, there were measurements, there were any number of things that grew from about 1980 on. I was fortunate enough to be among the group that negotiated the first foster care contracts, home attendant contracts, and a myriad of other services. I remember when preventive services did not exist, and thanks to Sister Mary Paul, if anybody ever remembers her, she was a wonderful, I know Eric does.
Sunset Park.
Sunset Park. She was sort of like the force behind creating preventive services. What a concept. We should prevent foster care as opposed to remediating it. But there were a number of advocates that proposed services, and the not-for-profit sector sort of emerged as a response to it. Interestingly, I think initially OMB, or the Office of Management and Budget, loved it because they saw it as cheaper because there were non-unionized workers delivering the service. There was also the growing sense that people from the neighborhoods could deliver the service better. Because they knew their constituents. So it was a very interesting thing. But, if you follow the evolution, it went from contracts that were given to groups who came and met with you, and I remember being there as well, and you gave them the contracts, to a highly competitive, very regulated RFP system where, commissioners' judgments do not particularly enter into the equation necessarily, but they're very codified so that they're people who read RFPs who don't necessarily know the people who they're grading, and everything is very, very legislated already and so on. But at the same time, we're measuring what the results are of the money we're investing, which we never did before. We're looking to see that there's quality in what we're doing. We're beginning to ask questions like, well, that's a nice strategy, but if it's not changing the lives of the people you're doing it with, should you continue to do that? Things that were never part of the equation 10 years ago. Mm-hmm. And it is even, changing and evolving right now. That being said, there will be a crisis eventually, because I think everybody who I've run not-for-profits and I've been in government, and government really is increasingly paying maybe 85% of the total cost of services. And the not-for-profit sector raises the difference. And they continue to do the service that is not well paid because they have a sense of mission and wanting to be helpful. That's wonderful. But at some point, many of these not-for-profits are very frail. They don't have an infrastructure. They're creating increasing debt. and what euphemistically they think it's a cash flow issue, is really a rolling deficit that they're just propelling onto the next year. And that is really serious because they are not just community-based organizations. They are the service arm of government. They're actually delivering the services. So at some point, we're all going to all sit down and figure out how do we not only formalize the relationships, but make it more viable so that people have health insurance, make living wages, and can afford to continue their mission.
Right. Roberto.
I want to be the contrarian. I want to put a little bit of a different narrative on the last 40 years, sort of a little bit of a different perspective. And let me begin with the basic notion. 70s, awful decade, it really was bad. I landed in New York City in 1968, so I can tell you it sucked. It was really bad. The notion that we went from that 70s, the recovery, the having saved the city by Mayor Koch and the people who stepped up, the unions and all of that, and that there was a recovery and that we now have an economic engine driving New York City. I'd like to sort of put a caveat to that and say, and today's New York City, students cannot afford to go to college because the education is out of the reach and the parents cannot pay for it. There is a housing mortgage crisis where some of the biggest home foreclosures in this country are happening in our neighborhoods. There is a pension crisis, and we claim that the people who have worked all their lives, we can't afford to pay a pension, that if you don't pay them, you got to ask yourself what's going to happen. And of course, they're all now popular wealth disparity. And I think that when it comes to public policy, there's 4 specific areas that have happened in the last 40 years that I think could be placed as sort of a foundation, or certainly different thresh points where something happened, that was a policy change that altered a lot of stuff, and we may not have been as cognizant of the consequences of that. Let me say that what happened in the 70s is not just white flight. It was government flight. The city of New York made a purposeful decision by its leadership because it lacked the political will to deliver services to community that has changed drastically because of their demographics. You're absolutely right. Planning board number 3, planning board number 5, 4, it got to the point where you could not get a fire department to answer because the fires were running out of control. And we made a decision as a city that we could afford to do that.
Right.
4 areas. First of all, the decision by President Clinton to say we will change welfare as we know it. Remember, welfare reform used to be like the darling of every political campaign, bringing the welfare rolls down. I cannot remember the last time that that was a subject for discussion, not only the city, not only the state, but anywhere in this country. Clinton decides that a constitutional right, because there is a need, no longer has to be that. The Congress approves it, and the state of New York under Rudy Giuliani and one Commissioner Turner goes about the business of deciding that we need to move people of welfare. Where they went or what they did, we're not quite sure. But during that 1990s, this decision to change welfare as we know it means that today, 40,000 people will be asking for a shelter. Tonight, 26,000 of them are going to be children. The affordable housing that Ed Koch provided because of vision and leadership and because we had a different city governance, which I'll mention in just a minute, is no longer available because we have walked away from that. Welfare as we know it meant that today, the 2 largest, most poorest congressional districts happen to be in the city. 25 of the 29 congressional districts in this state, it is actually reported that at least 10% of the people there did not have enough food for the last 2 years. 20% of the people living in the city right now are living in poverty. That did not happen by accident. We made a decision as a city, as a policy. Let me bring the second piece to this. city governance. When Koch was doing what Koch was doing with housing, there were 5 borough presidents. Each one of them had a vote on the borough estimate. Every county in the city had an opportunity to influence the city of New York policy-making decision. We decided, because there was a constitutional challenge to the one person, one vote, that could not be maintained. We did away with the Board of Estimate and created an expanded city council with 35 to 51 members. And you ask yourself the question, whenever the mayor, this mayor, the prior mayor, or the next mayor introduces a budget, how much power does the city council really has to alter that budget? I call it budget by budgeting at the margins. So what happens is the mayor introduces the budget, and the city council decides, what is it, $250 million, perhaps $500 million that you're going to play with? So the city of New York, as part of the city governance, we have created an institutional, legislative, and executive branch that may not well be best suited for something that happened afterwards, something called term limits. So now we have term limits. Board of Estimate is gone, Borough President have no powers, and we have a centralized government that is capable of doing much, because land use is the only one area where I would argue City Council can do some work in order to stop something. 2 other issues.
Before you get to those, I don't want to leave that point, because that's so, I mean,
But
let's come.
let me just make, because they're all intertwined.
What are the 2? What are they?
Just basically, majority control over our educational system.
Okay.
What was denied to Rudy Giuliani and was denied to David Dinkins and was denied to a Koch was given to the present mayor. But that gave us Chancellor Black, that gave us the doing away with the local boards, and that left something very little in between for what I consider to be citizen input. The last one is crime. You cannot talk about New York City in the 1970s, the crime in the 90s, the 2000s, without arguing that there was without recognizing something called Safe Street, Safe City. A mayor of the city of New York went up to Albany, and for the first time, Albany decided that we could impose a surcharge in New York City so that we could increase caps, so that we could attack this problem. That gave us the whole issue of Rudy Giuliani coming in and the broken windows. It gave us the whole idea of Comstock.
But it was Mayor Dinkins who med that request.
No,
for
Mayor
the
Dinkins,
Safe Street, Safe City, right? That's
no, Mayor Dinkins went to Albany. He got the money.
Right,
but
that's
if you
what I mean.
remember, 1993,
Right.
Giuliani gets elected. It's Giuliani
Yes.
who brings in this other new approach to
Sure.
policing, brings crimes down, and it also gives us something called stop and frisk.
So
So my point is the following.
I want to
Each one-
spend time
each one
on
of
that,
these
but I also want
decisions-
to.
Each one of these decisions has
Yes.
altered the city, and the consequences of that is that there has been less and less and less input and dialogue from the citizens.
So the governance piece about the Board of Estimate, deemed unconstitutional or in conflict with the Voting Rights Act, I believe was the concept, right? I mean, because the Bronx had the same, Staten Island had the same power as the Bronx in the mid-1980s, where Stanley Friedman and your predecessors in the Bronx Democratic Party, in fact.
Actually, the 3 ones before me went to jail. Okay.
Several years before you, indeed. But that corruption, and Meade Esposito in Brooklyn, I mean, that corruption was made possible largely because of the power of the Board of Estimate, right? So on the flip side, you have the reform.
Is that a statement or a question?
No, I mean, that's a discussion.
I disagree with that
so,
statement.
But before you leap into this, so there's that question, and then the other question of sort of the limited power of the city council that took its place, right? So neither system seemed, both systems had great weaknesses, right?
Let me just, to attach what Donald Maness did and what Stanley Friedman did and all of that to the Board of Estimate. I wish I had a good line to throw in there. Would be to suggest that you didn't have the mechanism and the safety in order to protect us from corruption. It wasn't the Board of Estimate, but I could argue that the same thing could happen under the present system. It is not that you had Borough President sitting at the Board of Estimate that gave license to 3 people to steal from this city. I would argue there were a lot of other factors involved in that, but that's another debate for another
No, that's a
night.
good point.
Okay.
So who else on the panel wants to take this? I mean, this question of the city council structure versus the Board of Estimate, that is probably the fundamental transition point in New York City governance over the last 40 years. Mark?
Yeah, I want to come at it from another angle, and that is in terms of housing policy and practice in the city of New York. And that's just one kind of channel to look at this issue through. And in fact, I would argue that in that realm, there has been enormous continuity from mayor to mayor, regardless of their political stripe, whether it was Mayor Dinkins, whether it was Mayor Koch, Mayor Dinkins, Mayor Giuliani, or the current mayor, Mayor Bloomberg, that you could see more continuity across those 4 administrations than you see dissimilarity. That the agenda during any one of those administrations, what corresponded more to the question of what the needs were. For instance, we're gonna renovate or rehab, do gut rehabs on all the vacant buildings in the city of New York, and work your way through that. We're going to build housing, much of it's single housing, family housing for many years, on the vacant land the city owns. Then we're going to move on under Giuliani, for instance. We're going to renovate all the partially occupied buildings in the city that the city of New York owns, which was 30,000 units. Incredibly complicated task. Both Koch and Dinkins primarily dealing with the vacant buildings, and then moving on from there with a lot of also preservation of existing multifamilies, put that aside. Mayor Bloomberg, in fact, under Mayor Bloomberg, the plan was to do the second iteration of the plan, the most ambitious, do 165,000 units of housing in 10 years and invest $7.5 billion up to $8.5 billion at one point in the plan. In fact, we're at 140,000 units. 2/3 of those units are preservation units. 1/3 of those units are new construction units. Go up to Melrose, look at Villa Verde, look at Barrios-Paoli Village, look at St. Anne's between 156 and 159th and Eagle, and I'm blanking on the other street. So when you look at this, there's more continuity, regardless of the form of government, in fact, regardless of whether there's Board of Estimate, going to the city council, there's been continuity in housing policy, and it's been that continuity, it's been that perseverance, it's been that commitment to rebuilding the city's neighborhoods that has allowed the city to leverage literally billions of dollars of private equity and lending into the communities themselves. Each of these areas that you talk about, governance or crime strategies, things like that, there's a separate discussion and argument perhaps to be had around it. But I think from my standpoint, having in fact been through this for 4 decades, unfortunately, or fortunately, what you see in housing policy is much more a sense of continuity and commitment than you see dissimilarities and sort of stops and starts in what the city is doing in the neighborhoods of the community of the city of New York. This is not to say, if I could just add one last thing, Andrew, that there obviously are huge issues remaining in this area. Remains an affordability crisis. Something like 50% of all households in the city of New York pay more than 30% of their income towards rent. There is, as you said, Roberto, a huge problem about foreclosed single-family houses that really is out of our, for most people, they don't see it. But there is a foreclosure belt that runs from East New York, Brownsville, through Jamaica, out into what used to be, and still are, middle-class precincts of Queens, Laurelton, Boroughs, places like that. And in that area, there in 2011, and up in the Bronx as well, there were 47,000 homes in the city that were either 90 days delinquent, that was 18,400, or 28,900 loans in foreclosure process. So that's maybe 175,000 folks are living in those homes. That's a nice-sized city that's in foreclosure or about to go into foreclosure. So it's not, this housing effort on the part of the city has been constant and I think extraordinarily effective, and the greatest argument for government intervention in the housing markets or in markets that you could make. But that doesn't mean that it can solve and address all these problems at one time, and that there aren't enormous problems remaining in the city of New York.
So who among you, just put up your hand, who among you thinks the city council structure is better than the Board of Estimate structure? Only one.
I just think it's different.
Liz,
But I think you have a better group of city council members under the post Board of Election world. But I don't disagree with Roberto's analysis that the city council has some land use powers, but he's absolutely right that you have a 63, 64, 65 billion dollar city budget. And I got to tell you, though, it was just the same way when I was lobbying the city council when they had the old system. Yeah. They were fighting over, 0.5% of the city budget. And here's where you're also right that every mayor has played it the same way. Doesn't matter what party they're in. Every mayor has figured out under the old system and the new system, I'm going to propose a budget that cuts the items that the city council most cares about and will spend all their time fighting. I will cut the things there. The advocacy community is the best organized to make sure it gets it back. They will fight to the death to demand the council put back in what the mayor took out. The mayor will secretly smile. Yeah, that's exactly what I wanted to happen anyway, right? And the punchline is that the mayor basically has total control over the budget exercise.
Yeah, I think that that's an important point. I mean, if I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I think that what I heard you say, and I agree with, is that increasingly government has become centralized in the authority of the mayor, and there's no counterbalance to the authority of the mayor. The borough presidents provided some of that. The council president provided some of that. That is pretty much gone. And the council, even though it has as many members as it does, because of term limits, frankly, by the time they get to know what their topic is about, they're gone. Right. And so that there's really no power in the city council, so to speak.
And that's why it's so difficult to answer your question.
Right.
It isn't, is it better or not, is what kind of city governance do we have that would allow each one of our 5 boroughs to have a say in their capital budget, in land use? Which city government would allow for that process? That's why I said that the Board of Estimate, not the this one, that would allow that while allowing the city council to play a legislative role that is rightfully its role. We have not thought about it. And remember this, we have not done a city charter revision post-term limit. Right. How can you have a city charter of the city of New York that did not envision that we will have one billionaire come in, Mr. Lauder, and institute term limits, and have another billionaire, Mr. Bloomberg, come in and decide that we're going to do away with it just for a term, but we'll go back. So this is a key discussion for the city.
Sure, but I think you could certainly make the case that in the 1980s, Ed Koch had pretty much the same kind of control that any mayor has had since. I mean, you say it right there, and the fact that housing policy hasn't changed. I mean, I mean, it has changed, but it's evolved.
But Andrew, political participation has collapsed since the end of the Board of Estimate. In 1989, 1 million more people voted in the mayoral elections than voted in 2009, even though the population of the city had grown by 1 million. If we look at the people who are now our controller and public advocate, they were elected with less than 10% of the vote of the population.
So why do you think that is?
Because what we're just talking about, the hyper-centralization, the Frankification of New York, has meant functionally that it doesn't matter who's on the city council.
If you're not the mayor, think about it. If you're a citizen of the city of New York, or you happen to be in one of the counties, and you're just unhappy about what the mayor of the city of New York is doing in your county, who do you go to? Council members represent a specific area. So you have to have a way of meeting the challenges of education, crime, in a way that is reflective of the people who live in the city, and we as a city have been unwilling to deal with one of the most fundamental issues. How do we govern ourselves?
Right. John.
I have to admit that I was a consultant to the 1988 and 89 Charter Revision Commissions and spent 2 years, in the trenches having discussions about these very issues. And I agree completely with Roberto and Fred in observing that the opportunities for influence in between, the neighborhood level and the mayoral level have atrophied in the city, and we do have a crisis of participation. 311,000 people voted in the Democratic primary in 2009 that led to the candidacies of the Democratic mayoral and city controller. And that was, the controller's race was pretty hotly contested. And you think that we have somewhere in the neighborhood of about 4.95 million voting age citizens, in the city, and 311,000 or 160,000 of them, who are the majority of the 311,000, are making the key decisions about who the nominees are going to be, you have to conclude that there is some kind of crisis of political participation and engagement in the city. I don't think the Board of Estimate was the cause of that, or reinstituting would necessarily be the remedy for it. But I do think that it's a serious, and I'm a partisan person. I don't believe that the nonpartisan election proposals that Mayor Bloomberg has repeatedly made would necessarily resolve the problem either. But we do need to think about new mechanisms for political competition. Too many incumbents run with just token opposition. We need to think about levels in between the very micro level and the citywide level where some important decision making can be and priority setting can be made.
Right, Mark.
Yeah, I'd like to come at this at a slightly different angle and
Pull the microphone close.
I'd like to come at this from a slightly different angle. And, in a prior job, I've had a number, I have a sordid career, and in a prior job, I worked for a national nonprofit called LISC. And we work with neighborhood-based groups, help build them, help them do development, provided them with grants and loans and equity. And I, had the luck in that job at some point to be overseeing programs in the Midwest and in the Northeast. So I oversaw programs in Philadelphia, in Toledo, in Cincinnati, in Indianapolis, up in Buffalo. I set up the program. And it was interesting because it gave me a view of city government that went beyond what I had experienced in New York City. And I must say that coming out of that, I came to appreciate the fact that New York City has a strong mayoral system. And I don't doubt that it can tilt in a bad direction. I don't doubt that that it can lead to its own unique forms of abuse and disregard for citizenry. But when I look at, I don't think the city could have mounted nor sustained its housing effort in the way it did and focused its resources, including community development block grant monies, on the neighborhoods that it did. If you had been in a city where you had, for instance, a real strong council but a weak mayor, or strong council, strong mayor, let alone like Cincinnati where they had weak mayor, weak council, and weak city, city manager. Having a strong mayor allowed the city to focus its resources and in a way that you couldn't find in other cities. So for instance, I understand, again, in the South Bronx, under Mayor Bloomberg's plan, the city, just HDC, I'm not counting HPD's lending and investment in the Bronx, and the Bronx as a whole, just my quasi-public agency, the Housing Development Corporation, has lent and leveraged $2 billion in housing development since 2000, I would say 2004. $2 billion. It didn't go to where the political power was. It didn't go to, it went to the neighborhoods, I believe, that really required that investment. And it's fair to argue, well, that's chance, or we need a political structure that ensures that occurs. But what I saw in other cities, for instance, was where you had relatively reasonable resources being fragmented because every council member or alderman or elected official got their piece of the action.
Right. Well, it makes me wish that Wayne Barrett was on this panel, because he could talk about how everybody got their piece of the action through the Board of Estimate. Right.
By
I mean, that was the way to get a piece of the action.
I could not agree with Mark more that there has been this continuity on the area of housing that is separate and apart from everything else. It is one of those instances where there has been a strength. I agree with, far it be for me, a former chairman of the Democratic Party and someone who's serving in Albany for 10 years, to argue that I don't appreciate centralized leadership and that the need to be able to get 250 people to agree on anything, much less politicians, much less people who are lawyers. Forget it. It's just difficult. I understand, and you need to do that. However, we need to be able to be smarter enough to say the following. if you get that, but you also get the other side. Mayor of the city of New York right now runs NYCHA. Mayor of the city of New York runs right now the New York City Education Department uninterrupted by anyone. There is no way. The city council doesn't have the leverage. The mayor of the city of New York runs the entire budget, runs every agency, and the question then becomes, what is it that we need to do with the legislative body that is different? Because other than overseeing, other than conducting public hearings where the commissioner can tell the city council member, love you, I think you're a great person, but go screw yourself. Right. I don't have to do this, because at the end of the day, we have created a system that does not allow, and this is not about Bloomberg, this is not about Rudy Giuliani. I hope to be one of the people who helps to elect the next mayor, so I hope the next mayor will be able to do its job, his or her job. This is about being able to have a system that allows, when the mayor is wrong in his policies, to have some sort of check and balance, and none exist because of term limits, and none exist because we found that we could create a legislative body that's not by virtue of the powers that we have not granted it. And I think we're smart enough to come up with something better.
Right. I want to talk a little bit about crime before we get to questions from the audience. I think to pivot off this is difficult in a way, but it really is. The NYPD and accountability, you raised this question before, the sort of the history of safe streets, safe cities morphing into what we now know as stop and frisk. We've been doing interviews in public housing for the last 6 months, and it's pretty clear that people in public housing actually want a positive relationship with police. And older folks in public housing really want more security. In general, we heard a lot about very positive comments about the crackdown on drug gangs, but there is a general feeling, particularly among young people in public housing, no surprise, that they are an occupied place in New York City. I mean, half of the trespassing arrests in New York in the late 2000s happened in public housing, because the city has the authority to stop anybody on public housing property. So that's just one example of the NYPD's role in city government. To what degree, looking back over the last 20 years, 25 years, has the decline in crime been a result of management and strategy in the police department or other factors? Liz, do you want to take that on first?
Well, when you look at the data, you can make a number of different arguments. One, a decrease in crime was demographically driven because of the changing population ages, so that as there were at certain times fewer 18 to 24-year-old men, crime rate went down, and when the population of 18 to 24-year-old men goes up, crime rate goes up. So that's a part of the story. Obviously, economics is a heavy part of the story. When people have jobs to go to and see that there's an opportunity for them to care for themselves and others through an economic pathway that is legal, you see lower crime rates. Right. I'll never forget doing eviction prevention work in East Harlem, and a man explaining very rationally and calmly he'd been in prison, he was out, his family taken him back, and they were going to be evicted, and either somebody was going to help him, or he knew how to get a gun and he knew how to take care of his family. And it was a very common, rational discussion where, you know, the economic analysis was very clear by him. But it's also true that police patterns and changes have had dramatic impacts for good and for bad in, I think, the relationships between people in the city over the last 30 years and in the outcome of crimes and quality of life. I'll just give the one example that I've been using for 17 years now. It was about 17 years ago. I was running a not-for-profit anti-poverty organization. It was about 30 people I brought in from different sites for a staff meeting. It was about a third black, third Latino, third white in my organization. And then we stopped for lunch, and everybody started to have a conversation, which I guess I'd run out of the room when I came back, and they were discussing at what age they had the conversation with their kids. Now, I thought we were going to talk about sex, right? What age do you have the conversation with the kids? And it was every parent talking about at what age they would explain to their kids what to do when stopped by the police so they didn't end up getting shot or beat up or arrested. And every black and Latino person in the room had a very clear, concise explanation of how they handled it with their kids. And every white staff person said, "What are you talking about? The only conversation we ever have with our kids about police is, if you think you're in trouble, look for a police officer." And I've been asking that question for 17 years of anybody that I feel comfortable enough with that has a kid. And it's not that it isn't changed, it's actually gotten worse. The level of detail and sophistication by parents of color in the city about what they have to do as good parents to teach their kids how they're not going to get beat up or arrested just for being kids is horrifying. So is part of that people are scared to do anything and so they won't get arrested or caught by the cops? When you look at the number of stop and frisks and the 50,000, is 50,000 still on marijuana busts after stop and frisks that we're doing in the city? You think, no, there's still a whole lot of interactions, at least in sub-universes, but if they're real issues. Now, it's also true, and I represent the wealthiest district in the city of New York and might be the whitest district. I never went out and reviewed, but probably close to the whitest. I'm 10 years in office. I've had 2 constituents come to me to talk about their belief that they were wrongly treated by the police. If I ask any of my colleagues from anywhere else in the city, whether they're council members, assembly members, or senators, they're going to tell me every day somebody comes to their office.
So Fred, I mean, there's obviously a flip side to this. Can you talk about what management change, what policy change really has made an impact here?
Well, first of all, let me just pick up Liz's point about demography and economics. What's interesting about the collapse in crime between 94 and 96, the sharpest drop in crime ever recorded in any North American city. It occurred in a period with no economic growth and no change in demography. It was entirely a function of how policing was carried out. Having said that, Bratton at the time, when he got pushed out by Giuliani, the worst move Giuliani ever made, was talking about the dangers of overusing stop and frisk. This is 1996. 16 years later, the problem is more apparent. The problem, I would suggest, and I don't have any answer, but thinking about Commissioner Kelly sitting before the city council, the people on the city council, a lot of them don't have anything more than double-digit IQs. They couldn't ask him.
Oh, Fred, that's...
Oh, no, that's perfectly fine. I'm not running for office, and people can say horrible things about me. But I've sat in enough of those meetings. And Mark talks about going to all these different cities. There's a kind of person who serves on the city council in every city. You go to Philadelphia, you go to Chicago, they could be transplanted to virtually every. They tend to be parochial and very limited and very interested in petty patronage. When Kelly put the question to the council, okay, you don't like stop and frisk? There's too much of it. I agree there's too much of it. What are you going to do about it? No one had anything positive. No one had anything concrete. No one had anything thoughtful to say. All they could do was pose. They could strike poses. And I don't know what's going to, I don't know who the next mayor is going to be, but I hope whoever the next mayor is brings back Bratton. Because Bratton has been thinking about exactly this problem. What happens when you get to this point? What do you do? How do you modify stop and frisk? I'm still waiting for anyone to say anything intelligent on it. I'm waiting for someone in the council to say anything intelligent on any subject.
Well, Fred, you just said something intelligent about it, that most of the drop in the crime rate was achieved without the massive application of stop and frisk in that earlier period. So just logically speaking, you can't explain the crime drop through stop and frisk.
In the land of the blind, the one-eyed man is king. Always, that's the case, of course. And it is so easy for anyone in a position of leadership, be it the police department, a commissioner, to go before any group and say, you tell me how to do it better. Well, I don't know, but that's your job. You're supposed to tell me how to do it better, and I'm telling you as a legislator that what you're doing is not enough. This is my experience, a little bit different than the gentleman that just spoke.
Yes.
The average person that I met in elected office...
in the New York State Assembly then.
That's okay. The average individual that I see sitting in legislative bodies is a thoughtful, hardworking person who really gives a damn about the neighborhood that they represent. It may not be that they are what you would call the top or the top of any one area, but you tell me what area, what academic institution has the top of everything, or what panel does. Let me just finish the thought.
They're elected with a tiny percentage of the vote. They don't represent their districts. They represent a few interest groups in their districts. They get elected with 4 and 5% of the population of those districts. They don't represent anyone but their own interests.
Well, the fact that people are getting elected by small numbers, if you were to have people elected by greater number, would not increase the ratio of intellect to the person serving, please. These are two different issues. This is the point that I'm making. The police department, I believe the lowering of crime happened as a result of a number of things. Number one, the fact that the city of New York, as a result of Safe Street, Safe City, had the power and the money to hire more cops. More cops, less crime. Number two, technology and the ability to be able to look at policing in a different way. And absolutely, it started with Bratton, and it was real, and a consequence of that, whether you're talking about cameras, you're talking about the ability to do the kind of technical work that you never did, the computers, the whole issue, that brought it to a certain level. What stop and frisk has become is a very convenient excuse for doing the work that should be done by a police department in order to make sure that entire neighborhoods do not feel that when they go into the neighborhoods, they're likely to get arrested because of the color of the skin and the way that they look. If you go into the Bronx at certain times during the day, you will believe that you are in a police state. And I guarantee you, we can make the city absolutely safe. All we got to do is put a cop in every single corner. We cannot afford it. There's got to be a better way than having to have parents tell their kids, let me have the conversation with you about when you interact with a cop. And I'm going to say the following, the last 10. This is not just about young people. This is about people who live in the city and certain notions about whether they are working men and women or whether they happen to be potentially criminals. And there's something fundamentally wrong with that. I'm going to leave something that Lillian said that I want us to think about. Lillian said when she started in government, government used to do all the work, employees. And then we went to non-for-profits. And then she also said non-for-profits now are under the gun. Budgets are down, non-for-profits have to either merge or they have to figure out how they live in this new existence. If government walked away from the job that it was supposed to do and we gave it to non-for-profits and now non-for-profits are kind of on the way out, you got to ask yourself the question, at the end of the day, what kind of a city are we going to have?
So I want to have questions from the audience. We got a couple people going around with microphones, and start over there.
My name is Lou Sapersky. I was an applicant for a job in public life, and the constituency didn't think I was qualified, so I'm not sure whether that would have helped the IQ or not. One basic point, and I have tracked this fairly carefully over the years, the decline in crime statistically in this city began measurably and clearly in the last 2 years of the Dinkins administration. Whatever pluses and minuses Mayor Dinkins had, that is a permanent and immutable part of the record. Commissioner Bratton had either the good judgment not to get in the way or to take advantage of what was a scenario for reducing crime and continued the trend, but it began in the last 2 years of the Dinkins administration, and I don't want to have the mayor's record have that mark on the mayor's record begrudged to him. As to the failures of the city administration, if commissioners had to go to the city council for the advice and consent of the council on their appointment, it would strengthen the council's ability to impact on the administration of the city, I think, in a very affirmative and very positive way. And the other thing is, budget power should be shifted to the council in much the same way that the House of Representatives has it in the federal government. And I think this would go a substantial way to level the playing field in the administration of the city and to give communities more say in city government.
John, what do you think about the idea of city council having greater power over the budget, and how would we get there?
I'm not sure there's a city council in the country, and this is a continuation of the point that Mark made earlier, that has great sway over city budgets. I think it's in the nature of the conflict between mayors as elected executives and councils that the mayors want to manipulate the councils into doing what the mayor wants them to do, and by hook or crook, one way or the other, they generally find a way to do that. And I'm also sympathetic to Mark's point that executive centralization, which is very pronounced in New York City, gives the government a greater capacity to act in a coherent manner than is often true in places where the responsibility is more parceled out. My personal, in the 88-89 period, my recommendation was we elect city council delegations by borough, and within the borough, without any districts, by proportional representation, so that, in a sense, the council people would come to identify with the borough that they represented. And this idea was opposed by every member of the commission, all the staff, and all the politicians that heard it, so it didn't get entertained very well. But New York City did have proportional representation for a good period, and maybe a more representative and more competitive city council at that point than it had subsequently. And I'm not sure what the right answer is, but I agree with many of the panelists that we do have a crisis of political participation in the city, and it deserves some fairly deep thought about what to do.
Interesting. So somebody who has mic, yeah.
I have a question about the nonprofit for-profit debate. It was just brought up by Mr. Ramirez. Particularly in housing, we're seeing more and more developments happening, being led by for-profit developers. We're also seeing deals where, maybe put together in the 90s, we were giving away vacant buildings or doing tax credit deals. Those deals are now being taken away in some senses from the nonprofits and given to for-profits with the promise that these groups are going to turn the affordable housing around in the city. So I want to ask if that's a recipe for failure or disaster in our affordable housing policy, and whether we're seeing that transition from nonprofit to for-profit in other areas of city government.
I can just say from the social services point of view that indeed there has been a movement towards allowing more for-profits to participate in the service delivery system. Very marked in personal care, home attendant services, very marked in employment and training, where, if you look at the last contracts that were awarded by either HRA or Small Business Services, there was a much larger participation of for-profits. That being said, I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing. I do think that it brings a whole different set of problems to be dealt for. I guess we're all going to be very honest here. I am not a fan of for-profits delivering social services, because I do think that the component of having a real belief in the mission is very important for that delivery. So that when you introduce the profit motive, you have other audiences that you're catering to, and that becomes very complicated. I think that we're going to see that in education increasingly. I think we're going to see it in many other places. Part of it has to do with capitalization. For-profits have deeper pockets. They have the ability of economy of scales. They have infrastructures. They have all these things that not-for-profits don't have. And so when you have a system for competing for a service where you have to write a very good proposal, and you have to have a sophisticated way of measuring things, and or if it, God forbid, if it is a performance-based contract in which you can lose your shirt if you don't meet certain demands, then, a small not-for-profit where you have, the executive director who's also the human resources person and the budget director and every other thing you could imagine, they cannot compete successfully. And I think that that's part of the problem, that we have to sort of begin to look at how do we deliver services best, and how do we shore up that part of the service delivery that is now the majority of people are not-for-profits, but may no longer be the majority in 5 or 10 years.
Mark, you wanted this?
Yeah, I think this is a complicated issue, and it's not a black and white issue. real estate's a business of scale. Property management, for instance, it's a business of scale. You know, you get a 6% management fee on a deal, 5% management fee on a deal. The cash flow is not that big, a 50-unit deal. There's not a lot of money there. So the only way you really build a strong property management operation, for instance, if you get to scale, in other words, you're doing managing a couple of thousand units or more, it's a business of scale because you need fairly sophisticated people who are underwriting deals, doing the development of a deal. And if you're in it, bring them on and nurture them and retain them, you got to pay them. You got to pay them some money. The only way you're going to get to that point is if you're doing scale. So the challenge in the city right now is and the process that's been going on is one of, in effect, consolidation. There are a lot of really powerful and wonderful nonprofits in the city of New York doing housing. There are a lot of very small groups who are kind of enlisted in this process back in the 80s and 90s. Again, you know, because there was, you know, there was lots of money to be devoted to housing, but there was also a shortage of folks out there who had roots in a community and could work in the community and were trusted and were prepared to do really difficult deals. So what you see now, I think, is this process of consolidation that's in fits and starts in a very difficult way going on. You know, but ultimately, I think nonprofits can compete, but you can't have 100 groups doing deals in the city of New York. The resources aren't there at this point. And the groups that can do it are going to be the groups of scale. So, for instance, our biggest lender, my biggest construction exposure is to a nonprofit, not a for-profit developer. It is to a nonprofit. And I can see out there a number of groups that I would hope would get to bigger scale. And in fact, I've talked to them about that. But the tension that the groups have, many of the nonprofits have, at least in the CDC realm, as opposed to supportive housing, the tension is that they come out of the community. Their roots are in the community. Their roots, in many instances, in most instances, are in a specific neighborhood. And how do you reconcile kind of the motives of participation, of participatory democracy, of self-governance, of you know, retaining your roots in a community? How do you reconcile that with expanding your catchment area to a much broader neighborhood than just between 163rd Street and 173rd Street and you know, whatever it is, Longwood Avenue and Kelly? That's a very complicated thing. So how do you maintain the democratic character of the group and yet get to scale and to the level where you can bring in and retain really strong people and manage big portfolios? And I think that's the challenge that the nonprofits, the CDCs in the city are confronted with. It's not a question with us, for instance, making decisions, oh, I'd rather do a deal with a for-profit, or I'd rather or for that matter, do a deal with a nonprofit. It's a question who's able to execute and execute for the long term, not just get the deal to closing, but to be the developer and owner and manager for the next 15 years or 30 years or beyond. And that's what I think we're all grappling with, or certainly I'm grappling with.
And add to that, on the housing side, so in the 80s and the early 90s, you had all these small, community-based, mission-driven organizations, and the city had all this in-ram they wanted to dump. And so if you take a look and you match-made sort of the worst troubled buildings with the highest cost and the lowest rent rolls, those are the ones that ended up going to the mission-driven small, I want to do this, but I don't know how.
Or to the tenants themselves.
Or to the tenants themselves. And then you saw also this drain, at least I did during the time I was working in those communities, you saw this drain of all this energy and talent who were organizing to help build and improve their communities into now they're the landlords evicting the people. And so I actually think it was a terrible mission change for a lot of groups, and that communities really lost out on some really strong organizing and self-building help because because people got into a business they shouldn't have gotten into.
It's a whole part of the discussion I was hoping we'd get to, but I'm glad you brought it up. But that you know, Ed Koch had a very clear political motive in creating that network of community development corporations also. I mean, it helped him diffuse criticism of his administration, turn the nonprofits, turn the activist groups into contractors doing work. Anyway, question over here.
My name is Albert Golston. I write on urban planning affairs, and I just wanted to dovetail on to what the gentleman brought up as far as housing is concerned and what the panel has discussed. The one issue is the so-called quote-unquote affordable housing. There are dozens and dozens of new developments that are going on throughout the city, and many of the developers have promised affordable housing to 15%, 20, 25, even up to 30%. Most people outside, I guess, this group and, in this type of community don't realize that those promises are not contractually binding, number one. Many of them are not. Number two, the whole idea of quote-unquote affordable housing, and there are different definitions. A family of four, $30,000, which is almost impossible. They've defined affordable housing as, let's say, a household of $100,000. Basically, there's a lot of inconsistencies. Many of these are not contractually binding. How does government help to keep the so-called salt of the earth within those communities and strengthening the so-called affordable housing definition?
Okay. Mark?
Yeah. There's not a deal that we do that doesn't have a regulatory agreement attached to it. And that regulatory agreement very specifically dictates who you can rent to, what their income levels can be based on the AMI, the area median income, and what the rent is that you can charge them, the maximum rent that you can charge them. And I think we take our responsibility, both at HDC, but also at the city's housing agency, HPD, quite serious when it comes to compliance. So if you look, and how would you measure that? If you look at my organizational chart at HDC, and we're a small organization, as opposed to HPD, which has 2,300 employees, I think. But if you look at my organizational chart, more than a quarter of my staff are devoted to asset management. In other words, devoted to, on the one hand, ensuring that when projects are rented up, the right people have a fair shot, right? There's a level playing field about getting a unit, and also that once those folks are in that unit, that they are charged the correct rent. So we oversee compliance very seriously. And I think that also goes on at the city, at HPD. In fact, I know that's the case. If you look at HPD, the most significant organizational change that's been made in HPD since 1986 to the present, at least in my judgment, is when the commissioner, at that time Rafael Sestero, made a decision that he would shed the organizational structure that was associated when the city owned all these units of vacant and partially occupied housing, and he'd shed that structure, create a new one, and put together a division of asset management, recognizing that a critical function that the agency now had to fulfill was overseeing compliance with a myriad of regulations when it comes to all the housing that has been developed under its auspices. So I think it's a mistake for you to say that developers, in effect, have a free rein about who they rent to and what they charge, not only day one, but for the next 15 years. That's simply not the case.
So I want to...
But he's not wrong that the definitions of affordability for different kinds of housing deals, your definition, my definition, and Mark's definitions can be really, really different.
So let me just quickly address that. Forgive me.
Well, really quickly,
let me quickly address that. What we have attempted to do, I think, in the mayor's housing plan is to build housing for a broad spectrum of New Yorkers. Not just the very poor, but certainly not for the rich, but for middle-income people. So let's think about the numbers. Let's say you make $100,000 a year. We don't do a whole lot of housing for that group. There's a program, Mixed Income or New Hop, where somebody could make $100,000 a year and pay a rent. 30% would be $2,500 a month. Okay? Now, that's a substantial rent. They're not poor people. There's no doubt about that. They're probably not working class, but they could be. It could be an four-person family. One person's making 50, the other person's making 50. One person could be a teacher in the public school system. The other person could work for the transit authority. From my standpoint, frankly, that's working class housing. That's a working class family. And do we have an obligation to try to build housing for working class families in New York City? I think so. We have to balance that with all the other demands on our resources and our capital, and we do. 2/3 of all our units, I think, are affordable to households at or below 80% of median income in the city of New York. The stuff that's been done under the plan actually is maybe 70%. So there's a substantial commitment to housing low-income folks and very poor folks. Is it substantial enough? Is there still a huge need? Absolutely, absolutely. And trying to figure out ways to address that need is sort of one of the challenges going forward.
All right, so I want to go straight down the line here and ask you to stay in, I want each of you to name one or two individuals who you think has had the most outsized or transformative impact on New York City over the last 40 years. And you don't even have to give an explanation. We don't really have time for explanations because we're going to finish in 2 minutes. But I want to hear one or two names from each of you of the person or people you think have had the most transformative impact. John, you want to start?
Well, I know Fred's going to hate this answer, but I think Mayor Bloomberg has been a very excellent steward of the city's assets and made the government work more like we think it should than previous mayors did.
Fred?
I'd probably say Bill Bratton.
Interesting. Lilliam?
Oh, my God. I think Stanley Brezhnev, who was deputy mayor under Koch and had a real impact on social policy.
Mm-hmm. Roberto?
In terms of policy, one positive, one negative, given the city of New York, and I am leaving out so many people, but in terms of positive, Koch transformed the city because of his because of his housing policies. And on the other side, I would have to say is Giuliani on the other side.
Mark?
Well, I'd be remiss if I didn't say the current mayor, Mayor Bloomberg. This is being taped, and I think I know Lillian shoulder with me, but I think on the one hand, Mayor Koch really made enormous contributions to the city in its present form then and to its future, and shaped so much of the city's sort of arc. When I was back then, I had all sorts of disagreements with him, and I have lots of disagreements with him today. But there were policies. The 10-year plan was one of them that were absolutely critical and kind of defined what housing policy would be in the city of New York and set the standard that all have followed. I think I can sincerely say Mayor Bloomberg in this sense. Again, I can understand where people could have disagreements with the mayor about a variety of policies, but I think there are certain areas, not just housing, where he has been really superb. When I compare to the rest, measured against everybody, all the mayors out there, but also the past mayors. And the mayor really has stepped up in the housing area. But when I think about the environment, when I think about public health, when I think about green, thinking around climate change, I think the mayor has really, really done a wonderful job.
And Mark, $20 billion that disappeared down the rat hole in education, where does that figure in your calculations?
All right, that's our next discussion. Liz?
I wasn't going to say Koch, but I would say Koch with the control board actually forced a radical change in the city of New York for the good, although it didn't always feel like it, and Giuliani absolutely for the bad.
Interesting. All right, so...
And 100 other people that I did not mention that I should have mentioned.
Right.
Say the whole leadership of HPD. I want to thank all of you for sticking it out, and I know this is really late, and thank the panel.